Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. My grandfather was the designated family photographer in my family for many years. And while he was an enthusiastic photographer, he was technically imperfect. Most of the time, our photos had his finger in the lens, or everything was out of focus, or the birthday girl's head would be cut off. Not that I'm speaking from experience, but whenever he was asked about this, why do you keep volunteering to take these pictures when they don't exactly turn out that well, his answer was always the same. It's hard to get the right thing in focus. And what I didn't realize at the time is that his response was actually some life wisdom. It's hard to get the right thing in focus. I don't know about you, but there seem to be a million competing priorities for our time and attention. And if you focus on all of them, it tends to turn out a little blurry. But what do we do? What do we do in the midst of this uncertainty? How do we figure out what should be in the center of our frame? How do we figure out where to focus our time and our attention? This is a question that I really resonate with, and I think that it's a question that Mark really resonated with as well. Because he's writing his gospel to the very early church, who is in the midst of a lot of uncertainty. Now, we think that the gospels tend to come first, but they actually came after people were familiar with Paul's letters, and Paul has just been killed. And Mark's gospel comes in response to that, to help this growing group of Christians figure out what's important. What does it mean to live a Christian life when all around us is uncertainty of persecution and finding a new identity as a church? And Mark uses this tool all throughout his gospel to help us focus, to help us see what's most important. The fancy word for this is a chiasm, which comes from the Greek word chi, which is just an X. And what it means is the most important thing is in the middle, in the center of that X. And to give you an example of what this means, there's a passage in Mark where he talks about a fig tree, and then Jesus goes into the temple and cleanses the temple, and then on the way back, he passes the fig tree again. And critics of Mark are saying, why is Mark telling us about the fig tree? He's already told us once. He doesn't need to keep repeating this story. But what he's saying is the fig tree is the frame, and what's important is what is happening in the center, this cleansing of the temple. Now, today's reading in Mark is the very center of Mark's gospel. It is the middle. It is where Mark is telling us the heart of the Christian faith lies. And this is a little confusing at first because this gospel reading seems super random. There's three really different things going on in this passage. The first is that Jesus is predicting his own death and resurrection. The second thing is the disciples are fighting with one another, squabbling over who is most important. And the third thing is that Jesus is welcoming a child into the midst of the assembly. Those sound like totally disconnected things unless you realize that this is at the center of Mark's gospel. This is what's in the middle of the frame. Mark is saying this is what it means to live a Christian life. It means to abide with the crucified, risen one, Jesus the Christ. It means to serve one another with selflessness and abandon. And it means to welcome those at the margins. It's important to understand this story that we think of welcoming a child like a precious moments figurine. Oh, look, there's this adorable child who's vulnerable and we need to take care of that person. But that is a very 21st century way of seeing a child. In Jesus' time, children were not seen as valuable. They were not seen as small people that we needed to tend and nurture into adulthood. They were seen as the lowest of the low, someone who had no status. And what Jesus is saying here is when you welcome those, the lowest of the low, into your midst, you are with me. So Mark is providing this frame, this structure on which to hang a Christian life. And I recognize in this story the basics of Christian discipleship. And here at St. Paul's, we talk about the basics of Christian discipleship with the 5 tenets, that there might even be a card in front of your pew describing them. praying, worshiping, learning, serving, and giving. And this can act as a framework on which we hang our lives, so that when we are in the midst of uncertainty, we're not trying to come up with what we do or how we focus all on our own. Frameworks aren't just about providing focus, though. They're also about providing structure. You frame a house, you provide the structure for the walls to hang. If you're an artist and you frame a canvas, you provide the structure on which your canvas will be wrapped around. And what is really curious about an artist who's framing an image is that it's way easier to frame a blank canvas than a canvas that already has something on it. A blank canvas, you can just wrap it around the frame, and it doesn't really matter. If that frame is broken or starts to sag or in some way needs to be adjusted, you have to reframe that work of art. In this way, all of our lives are like a work of art that already has something painted on it. We are all living into our unique vocations that God has called us into. And yet at times we may need to adjust that frame. We may need to make sure that what is the most important is at the center of our lives. The good news is that God has already showed us how to do that. We don't have to make it up. We don't have to figure it out as we go along. By hanging on to these time-tested habits of Christian discipleship, we are able to draw near to God, just as God has already drawn near to us. I speak to you in the name of one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.